Selected 1. The individual who has been planning a covert effort to damage your reputation was now fully revealed. Additionally, their humiliation is so severe that people are really leaving them in real time. It's all backfiring in the most dramatic manner imaginable. Every lie they spread about you, every individual they persuaded to turn against you, and every door they covertly locked behind the scenes. And you'll be astounded by what comes next. Most likely, you have encountered someone who always appeared to know what was best for you. Perhaps your parents prevented you from making your own choices. They said that since they were older, more seasoned, and more pragmatic, they knew better. A brother who made you feel like nothing you did was ever good enough, and who was always criticizing your decisions. A buddy that constantly expressed ideas on your finances, career, and relationships. Someone who caused you to question every choice you made. In your ostensibly chaotic existence, this individual presented themselves as your defender, your advisor, and a voice of reason. They persuaded you that you would make grave errors if you didn't consult them. They convinced you that your intuition was incorrect. Your freedom was risky, and your aspirations were unattainable. They had a knack for making their critiques seem kind. The only reason I'm telling you this is because I care about you. You need someone to watch out for you. Later, when you realize I was correct, you'll thank me. To defend control, they turned worry into a weapon. Does it sound familiar? Emotional manipulation begins just like this, and it occurs more often than most people think. You see, you have been selected. This may seem dramatic, but let's look at what it really implies in real life. Everywhere you go, you have the innate capacity to uplift others, spot dishonest individuals, and effect constructive change. When people need guidance, they naturally turn to you. You have excellent people and situational intuition. This is something that some people knew about you long before you did, and they dreaded it rather than rejoiced. They saw that their personal desire to be the center of attention, the one making decisions, and the one everyone looked to for direction was threatened by your innate leadership skills and genuine presence. They were aware that their power over you would end if you ever had complete faith in yourself, ceased wanting their approval, and recognized your own value. They thus created a whole system to maintain your social, financial, and emotional reliance on them. This is how they accomplished it. And because these are standard manipulative techniques used by toxic individuals worldwide, you'll be able to identify them. First of all, they dominated the story that other people told about you. Family members were told, you were irresponsible with money, always struggling, always making poor choices. They also shared stories about your past misdeeds, as if they were current behavior, making sure that everyone was aware of your failed business venture, failed relationship, or time you were fired. However, take note of how they presented these tales. They didn't bring up the fact that you were fired for confronting a terrible supervisor, that your relationship ended because you finally set standards, or that your company failed because you were learning and developing. They just emphasized the failure, excluding all the development and learning. Before you ever met possible mentors, employers, or love partners, they made sure that anybody who may give you chances knew about your issues. These folks already had a certain mental picture of you, someone in need of direction, someone who wasn't quite up to the challenges of adulthood. Consider the moments when chances appeared to just appear out of nowhere. When you suddenly felt estranged from individuals you thought liked you. When the invites ceased to arrive. When doors that ought to have opened remained securely closed. Most likely, you questioned what you did wrong, felt inadequate, and blamed yourself. Perhaps despite your qualifications, you applied for employment and never received a response. Perhaps you were arbitrarily left out of friend or family get-togethers. Perhaps a love attraction first looked ardent, but then waned for no obvious reason. This was absorbed by you as proof that you were flawed. You began to think that you may not be as competent as you once believed. Perhaps you needed someone else to help you make choices. Perhaps you were the issue after all. What if, however, none of it applied to you? What if someone was ensuring that the doors remained closed in the background? They were using a bad public relations strategy to manage a reputation. Every discussion about you was deliberately directed at your flaws. They made it clear in every narrative that you needed their protection and direction. They became your go-to source for information on your life, and the authority on you. The sneaky thing is that they often combine falsehoods and truth. They would tell others about your actual troubles, which you had confided in them, but they would omit the part about how you overcome them. They would talk about your actual faults, but not the lessons you learned or the development that resulted. Their portrayal of you became credible as a result. Because their statements included enough truth to make the falsehoods look plausible, people believe them. You are only attempting to live your life in the meantime. You may have studied self-help books, gone to therapy, tried to recover from previous trauma, and learned how to create boundaries as part of your self-improvement. You believed that this was personal development that alone had an impact on you. You were unaware that your mending was endangering their whole system of authority. You were learning to trust your own judgment throughout those treatment sessions. That implied that you would no longer ask for their consent before making any decisions. The effort you were doing to establish boundaries. That implied that you would no longer put up with their control and criticism. The activities you were doing on self-worth. This implied that you would no longer accept their unfavorable opinion of your ability. They could feel that you were moving further away from their control with each step you moved ahead. They failed to account for the fact that genuine development cannot be concealed. You stop taking therapy that is familiar but damaging as you begin to recover from trauma. Because you've studied manipulation techniques in treatment, you are able to identify them. Instead of picking individuals who continuously push against your limits, you start choosing those who respect them. You routinely make better selections when you learn to trust your intuition. You almost accepted the position, but something didn't seem right. You discovered later that the firm was poisonous, and your intuition was correct. Something about that individual appeared strange, so you chose not to date them. You found that they tended to manipulate others in their relationships. Toxic individuals will naturally leave your life when you establish limits. Not having unrestricted access to your time, effort, and emotional labor is too much for them to bear. When you stop putting everything on hold to deal with their crises or find solutions to their issues, they get irate. Everyone in your immediate vicinity was starting to notice these changes. When you stop putting up with disrespect, the controller would imply you were being difficult, despite their best efforts to paint them as issues. When you stop sacrificing everything to attend to their emergency, they would accuse you of being selfish. When you began to choose connections that really supported you rather than depleted you, they would say you were changing for the worst. However, those with sight could see what was really taking place. You were becoming stronger, healthier, and more self-assured. Better results were coming from your choices. Your life was obviously becoming better in quantifiable ways. You were making choices without weeks of mulling over them, sleeping better, and experiencing less anxiety. You were drawing in healthier connections and greater chances. You were recovering from setbacks more quickly and managing stress more skillfully. Their terror really started at this point. Take a time to think about it. I have a very significant matter that requires your attention. We're sharing what we know about personal power, self-healing, and self-healing for the first time. No holding back, no filters. All of the esoteric secrets we have accumulated during actual years of spiritual practice have been subtly included. Those who are prepared to follow the same road may now access the methods and knowledge that changed us from being controlled pawns into conscious creators. You are cordially invited to join Obsidian Inner Order and provide your support to our platform so that we may keep expanding our megaphone and reach more selected individuals who are awaiting activation. Joining the Obsidian Inner Order gives you access to more than simply information that is prohibited. You're joining a movement that is changing the very fabric of reality. All of us benefit from it. The description contains a link. Some individuals become aware that they're losing control, and you know how they feel. They don't retreat politely. They become more intense. They get desperate. They begin acting in ways that betray their true selves. This is precisely what took place, and they were careless due of their desperation. They began contacting old acquaintances, past coworkers, extended relatives, and everyone else who was connected to your life. These individuals were informed that you were in a crisis, making risky decisions, and on the verge of catastrophe. They portrayed themselves as the only thing between you from total destruction. They would phone a relative you hadn't talked to in years and express concern about your mental well-being. They would contact previous coworkers and imply that you were experiencing financial difficulties. They would get in touch with old pals and express their worries about your recent relationships or decisions in life. Some of these folks believed they were helping you and really cared about you. Because they were informed that you were in difficulty, your family members who got these calls felt compelled to intervene. Your former pals wanted to help you because they felt bad about not keeping in contact. Others just enjoyed participating in the drama. They took pleasure in being involved in the story and having inside knowledge. Being consulted about someone else's life made them feel significant. However, they were all receiving a well-written version of your narrative that made you seem unstable, and your controller appeared to be a paranoid saint who was putting their own health at risk to protect you from yourself. To keep an eye on you and provide updates, the controller gathered a horde of worried individuals. In order to periodically check in with you and assess your mental health, they requested these individuals to monitor your social media accounts and notify you if they learned anything concerning your work or relationships. Under the pretense of a support system, they established a surveillance network. They were also developing more formal routes in the meantime. By submitting papers implying you were incapable of handling your own financial affairs, they attempted to engage the judicial system. Concerned about your expenditures, they got in touch with your bank. They sent hazy signals about your stability to your place of employment. They made an effort to compile documentation that would support their continued meddling in your affairs. They wanted formal proof that you need supervision and direction, something they might use if someone questioned their role in your private matters. A lot of folks crack at this stage. The loneliness, the unrelenting criticism, the impression that everyone is against you, and the possibility that you are indeed just as incompetent as they portray you to be. It is intended to force you to give up and accept their authority as the simpler choice. Under the pretense of caring, it is psychological torment. It also targets your innermost self-doubts, which you didn't break, which makes it highly powerful. Rather, you took an unexpected action. You made a move. You may have actually moved to a different city, a different career, or a different environment altogether. You moved away and began over someplace they couldn't keep tabs on you or dictate who you met or what possibilities you were presented with. Or maybe, in a figurative sense, you entered a new stage of life when you no longer cared about what others thought. Their criticism no longer had the ability to harm you because you had become so strong in your own self-validation. You got so sure of your own judgment that you stopped listening to their recommendations. In any case, you developed beyond their grasp. You outgrew your vulnerability to their manipulation. Because all of their tales about you were predicated on keeping you tight and little, that's when their meticulously built house of cards began to collapse. You had to remain reliant, local, and inside their area of influence throughout their whole story. Their whole narrative collapsed when you demonstrated that you could prosper without their supervision. How were you doing on your own? If you were indeed as incompetent as they said, how were you making great choices on your own if you really required their advice? If you were really having trouble, how were you clearly doing? They asked, but their falsehoods would only last as long as others were unable to see who you really were. You were just seen by someone who had fallen for their falsehoods about you. Perhaps at a professional gathering where you were obviously well-liked and accomplished. Perhaps on social media, where your life seemed content and steady. Perhaps you happened to run into a common acquaintance who was able to see how well you were doing firsthand, and what they saw didn't align with what they had been told. You seemed confident, successful, content, and healthy. It was obvious that you were doing well, not just getting by, but flourishing. You had a lot of energy. Instead of seeming disorganized and struggling as they had been led to expect, you seemed composed and calm. Your well-dressed appearance suggested that you were financially stable. Your calm and assured manner suggested that you were emotionally well. You seemed to know precisely what you were doing and where you were going because of the zeal and clarity with which you described your life. This individual began to pose genuine inquiries rather than only courteous small conversation. For what duration were you performing so well? How did you get things back on track? Who was assisting you in making these blatantly wise choices? When I last heard about you, you were so much happier and healthier. What was your secret? All of a sudden, the controller was in a precarious situation. Someone who was apparently falling apart appeared better than they had in years, and they had to explain why. They had to explain why someone who ostensibly needed continual direction was obviously making wise decisions on their own. Their justifications were nonsensical. They contradicted themselves and stumbled. They made an effort to minimize your evident achievement or imply that it was just transitory. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, they maintained that you were still having difficulties. They sounded more desperate the more they spoke. It became more clear that they were lying the more they said you were in jeopardy. At this point, other individuals began to make connections. Family members started to recall all of the discussions in which this individual insisted on speaking for you, making choices for you, and interpreting your words and actions for other people. They were aware of how often this individual had diverted the topic from your accomplishments to your issues. They recalled instances in which you had excellent news to offer, but the discussion always seemed to center on your controller's worries about your decisions. They remembered how this individual never appeared to appreciate your successes, but always seemed to have inside knowledge of your hardships. Friends began to wonder why they had been receiving such a bad impression of someone who was obviously doing well. They started to question what other false information they had been given. They began analyzing their own interactions with the controller and identifying comparable manipulation patterns. The individuals who had been enlisted to keep an eye on you and report back began to feel taken advantage of and controlled. They were aware that they had participated in a horrible scheme cloaked in compassion. They realized that they had been invited to take part in monitoring that was really doing no good and that they had been misinformed. And they began to back off one by one. There were some who apologized. They clarified that they had received inaccurate or insufficient information. They acknowledged that rather than adopting someone else's interpretation of your tale, they ought to have had a direct conversation with you. They apologized for whatever part they may have had in disseminating false information about your life. These apologies were often extensive and passionate. Family members acknowledged that they had been concerned about you because of misleading information and felt bad about not getting in touch with you to see how you were doing. Friends said that they had been avoiding you because they believed you were going through a tough moment and were unsure of how to support you. Others just ceased taking part in the activity. When the controller attempted to bring up your alleged issues, they shifted the topic, refused to report on your actions, and refused to share gossip. They left the campaign against you and ceased interacting with the monitoring network. In the meanwhile, your life continued to improve in ways that made there seem more and more ridiculous. You weren't having financial difficulties. You were seeing tangible results and making wise financial choices. Perhaps you had begun investing, saved money, or paid off debt. You could have discovered a better paying work, created a profitable side company, or received a promotion. Anyone looking could see that you were financially stable. Emotionally, you weren't unstable. You were more composed and at ease than you had been in years. People saw that you seemed more self-assured, less nervous, and more capable of managing stress. Instead of always doubting yourself, you were making snap judgments and following through on them. You weren't reliant on unhealthy partnerships. Healthy relationships with individuals who respected your limits were coming your way. You received thoughtful and kind treatment from your new acquaintances and love interests. Instead of being domineering or theatrical, your professional connections were cooperative and encouraging. In fact, every area of your life that they had said was collapsing was thriving in quantifiable, visible ways. The disparity became clear. You had a person on one side who was obviously prosperous, healthy, and making wise decisions. As their falsehoods were revealed, the person on the other side became more and more frantic in their obsession with controlling the story of others. For those concerned, the decision of whom to trust became clear. This had a cascading impact that no one anticipated. Not only was the controller becoming less credible, because of you, everyone began to doubt everything else they had ever stated. What else had they lied about if they had lied about this? Were they also manipulating other people if they were this way with you? The social repercussions were immediate and catastrophic. The invitations ceased to arrive. Calls were no longer being returned. Group decisions no longer solicited or appreciated their input. They were going through the same kind of seclusion that they had attempted to force upon you, but without the development and recovery that had made your time of seclusion fruitful and life-changing. Here's the psychological reality that explains why this is so fulfilling. When control is taken away, those who gain power via manipulation and control are left without a solid base. Their whole identity is predicated on their capacity to control the opinions and decisions of others. They have nothing left to rely on when that capacity vanishes. Since all of their relationships were built on control dynamics, gossip, or stage drama, they're unable to trust in real relationships. Since their reputation was based on deceit and manipulation, they cannot be trusted. Because they have been so preoccupied with manipulating others that they have become disconnected from reality, they are unable to trust their own judgment. Their shame is so total and painful because of this. They're dealing with more than simply the fallout from their behavior. When they're unable to manipulate others, they are confronted with the reality of who they really are. And when you're allowed to be yourself, you're finding your true self. Everyone can now see all the traits they attempted to hide. Your innate leadership qualities, your sound judgment, your potential for development and transformation, and your ability to motivate others simply by leading an authentic life and rejecting limits that don't benefit you. Your vibe attracts others because it is genuine. They can see that you've overcome obstacles and come out stronger rather than worse off. Since honesty is so uncommon, they are aware of it and want to be around people who provide hope for development and progress. Because your reputation is founded on your true self and not on false information spread by others, opportunities are becoming available. The people who matter can finally see the true you, strong, resilient, competent, and inspirational. Because you're choosing choices that are in line with your own beliefs and talents rather than attempting to win over others, success is coming to you. The individual who tried to persuade everyone that you were failing for years is now seeing your success in ways that make their falsehoods seem not just incorrect, but absurd. The reason for their total humiliation is not because they intended retribution, but rather that truth has a way of coming to light, regardless of how much someone tries to conceal it. In reality, you are gaining financial stability and developing your decision-making skills each time they warned someone you couldn't be trusted with money. In reality, you are gaining knowledge and sound judgment by experience and introspection each time they cautioned others that you made poor decisions. You are really becoming more independent and self-sufficient each time they portrayed you as helpless and dependent. The narrative they made up about you has been totally destroyed by the truth of who you are. In fact, their efforts to manipulate you help you acquire the same traits they said you lacked. Having to deal with their manipulation taught you to quickly distinguish between real and phony individuals. You can quickly identify control methods, guilt trips, and emotional manipulation. You've now created an internal warning system to keep you safe in such circumstances. You learn to trust your own judgment by surviving their control system. When everyone around you tells you that you're wrong, you've learned to trust your gut and follow your instincts, even if they go against the grain. You discovered your own potential when you were able to overcome their limits. They unintentionally produced the same result they were attempting to avoid, but when you stop asking for permission and start doing, you found stores of power, ingenuity, and resilience you never thought you possessed. Now you're live evidence that their opinion of you was wholly inaccurate. Every accomplishment you make, every wholesome connection you form, and every sensible choice you make proves that their perception of you was a fabrication created to satisfy their desire for control rather than accurately representing your skills. This is now evident to those who count. They realize that you were never protected by the individual who undermined you for years. They were defending the authority they had over you, and that authority is permanently lost. You've liberated yourself not just from their authority, but also from the whole way of thinking that allowed them to do so. You've gained the ability to trust yourself, accept your own judgment, see deception when it occurs, and pick relationships based on respect for one another rather than convenience or familiarity. It is no longer possible to manipulate, influence, or persuade you to accept anything less than what you deserve. Everyone who cares can now clearly see the chosen one they worked so hard to hide. And that light, your true self, your true strength, your true value, can never be extinguished. In the most degrading manner imaginable, your controller is learning this lesson. Additionally, you're picking up even more useful knowledge. The world works in your favor when you live a genuine life. Have faith in yourself and don't accept restrictions that don't work for you. The fraudster who attempted to compose your narrative has been discovered. You may now compose your own tale at last. One of reality, development, achievement, and genuine strength that no one can ever take away from you.